One newly released email quietly shifted how people are looking at an old, unresolved story. Not because of a new accusation, but because of who wrote it, when it was written, and who it was sent to. According to publicly released court records, a message sent in 2010 by a senior royal family member to Jeffrey Epstein has resurfaced. And its wording has raised fresh questions about judgment, context, and proximity. This wasn't a legal filing. It wasn't a sworn statement. It was a private email written after Epstein had already been convicted, and it's now part of a massive document release by the U.S. Department of Justice. So why does this single message matter now? On January 30th, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed millions of pages connected to past investigations into Jeffrey Epstein. These documents include emails, contact lists, and correspondence involving public figures whose names have circulated for years, often without direct context. Most of the material does not introduce new charges. Most of it does not establish guilt, but it does provide a clearer picture of who remained in contact with Epstein after his 2008 conviction. And that distinction matters. Among the newly surfaced documents is an email exchange from March 2010 involving Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess of York, and Epstein. The message was reviewed by multiple outlets, including People, and is now part of the public record. According to those reports, Epstein asked Ferguson about a potential trip to New York. Her reply referenced waiting for her daughter, Princess Eugenie, to return from a weekend away. The language used in the email was informal and crude, the kind of phrasing many would consider inappropriate, especially given the circumstances. But it did not describe illegal activity, nor did it suggest wrongdoing by Eugenie herself. Still, the timing is what has drawn attention. At the time the email was written, Princess Eugenie was 19 years old. Just days from turning 20, Jeffrey Epstein had already pleaded guilty in 2008 to crimes involving a minor. He had served time in custody and was under post-release restrictions. That context is why this message, more than a decade later, is being re-examined. To be clear, no accusation has been made against Princess Eugenie, no legal claim has been attached to this email, and no wrongdoing has been alleged based on the message alone. But public reaction has focused on judgment, specifically why a senior royal figure would continue communicating casually with a convicted offender, and why such language would be used at all. A spokesperson for Sarah Ferguson declined to comment when contacted by media outlets. Buckingham Palace also did not immediately respond to requests for clarification. That silence has left interpretation to the public, and to the broader context surrounding the Duke and Duchess of York. This email does not exist in isolation. Other correspondence from 2009 and 2010 shows Ferguson expressing gratitude to Epstein for financial assistance during a period when she was dealing with personal debt. In a later interview, she publicly described accepting that help as a terrible error of judgment. She also stated clearly that she condemns crimes involving minors and expressed regret for maintaining that association. However, additional private emails released years later suggest the relationship continued for some time after those public statements, a contradiction that has fueled renewed scrutiny. And this is where the story widens. The email release has also revived attention around Prince Andrew, who has long faced questions over his relationship with Epstein. Andrew has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing. He stepped back from public royal duties in 2019 following a widely criticized BBC interview in which he discussed his association with Epstein. Recently released files include photographs, email, references, mentions of social interactions involving Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. None of these materials introduce new charges, but together they reinforce how closely intertwined certain social circles remained even after Epstein's conviction. This renewed attention comes at a sensitive moment. Sarah Ferguson is reportedly preparing to vacate Royal Lodge, the Windsor residence she has shared with Andrew for years. At the same time, political leaders in the UK have renewed calls for transparency regarding anyone with information related to Epstein's network. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer recently stated that anyone with relevant information should be willing to share it, emphasizing a victim-centered approach. The timing has turned what might have been another archived email into a flashpoint. When people hear millions of files released, it's easy to assume a single, coordinated reveal. In reality, these disclosures happen in phases, often driven by court orders, archival reviews, and legal challenges around privacy and relevance. Many of the documents unsealed in late January were known to exist for years. What changed wasn't their content, it was their status. Once material becomes public record, journalists can review it in full, cross-reference timelines, and compare private correspondence against public statements made at the time. That's why older emails can suddenly feel new. They aren't revealing new crimes, they're revealing continuity. A key point often gets lost online. Continued contact is not the same as criminal involvement. The DOJ release does not claim that everyone named participated in illegal acts. What it shows is something more uncomfortable and harder to headline. How certain relationships persisted after Epstein's conviction, despite reputational risk. For the public, that raises questions of judgment awareness and accountability, not criminal guilt. And this distinction is critical for understanding why outlets like People and the BBC are being careful with language, relying on according to records, reported exchanges, and publicly available information. The Ferguson email drew attention not just because of who was involved, but because of tone. The phrasing was casual, familiar, dismissive of gravity. In isolation, it might have been brushed off as poor taste, but placed against Epstein's documented history, it reads differently to modern audiences. That's not a legal conclusion, it's a cultural one. Public tolerance for proximity to convicted offenders has shifted dramatically since 2010. Language once considered private banter is now evaluated through a lens shaped by later revelations and survivor testimony. For public figures, especially royals, perception often carries consequences, even without formal findings. Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew occupy a unique space, no longer active working royals still. Deeply associated with the institution and still subject to public scrutiny, every new document adds pressure, not because it proves something, but because it reopens questions the public believes were never fully answered. And institutions historically struggle more with unanswered questions than with confirmed outcomes. One of the clearest through lines in the released material involves money. Ferguson has acknowledged that Epstein assisted her financially during a difficult period. She later described accepting that help as a serious mistake and issued a public apology. What complicates the narrative is the timeline. Public regret followed by private warmth in later correspondence. That gap between public accountability and private communication is where trust erodes, not just in individuals, but in systems meant to self-police. Again, this is about credibility, not criminality. Some ask, why revisit this now? Because unresolved influence doesn't expire. The Epstein case continues to matter not due to sensational details, but because it exposed how access, wealth, and status can insulate behavior, even after convictions. Each document release adds another data point, not a verdict, but a pattern, and patterns shape reform. It's worth noting what responsible outlets are not doing. They're not speculating beyond the documents, they're not assigning guilt by association, they're not publishing unverified claims. Instead, they're letting timelines speak. In an era of fast outrage, that restraint is intentional and necessary. Lost in email headlines are the individuals harmed by Epstein's actions, whose experiences prompted these investigations in the first place. Political leaders, including Prime Minister Keir Starmer, have emphasized that transparency must remain centered on those victims, not on reputational defense. That framing matters because it shifts the focus away from scandal and towards systems that failed. More documents are expected to be reviewed. More names may resurface. Not all of them will be relevant. But each release sharpens the same question. How much responsibility comes with proximity? And when does silence become part of the story? Some public cases don't conclude with verdicts or formal announcements. They fade, resurface, and evolve as new information becomes accessible. The Epstein investigations fall squarely into that category. There may never be a single moment where everything feels resolved. Instead, understanding builds slowly through documents, timelines, and patterns that only become visible in retrospect. That's why a single email from 2010 can still command attention today. Not because it changes the past, but because it reframes it. One of the clearest lessons from the Epstein case is how access functions. Not access in a criminal sense, but social access. Epstein moved through elite circles where associations carried prestige. Boundaries were informal and accountability was often assumed, not enforced. When individuals in those circles continued communication after his conviction, it revealed how slow social systems can be to recalibrate, even when legal systems already have. That lag is what the public is reacting to now. Institutions rely on trust more than explanations. For many viewers, this isn't about Sarah Ferguson alone or Prince Andrew alone. It's about how often powerful institutions expect credibility without transparency. When documents contradict earlier narratives, even subtly, trust weakens, not because of proven wrongdoing, but because of unanswered questions. And unanswered questions tend to linger. There's a difference between awareness and assumption. Responsible consumption means distinguishing documents from interpretations, separating legal findings from cultural judgment, and recognizing that inclusion in records is not proof of guilt. The DOJ releases are not verdicts. They are archives. Their value lies in context, not conclusions. Timing shapes meaning. An email written in 2010 is not received the same way in 2026. Cultural standards evolve. Awareness deepens. Language that once passed unnoticed now carries weight. That doesn't retroactively criminalize past behavior, but it does change how society evaluates responsibility, and that shift is irreversible. Very new release reopens the same fundamental question. How do systems respond when influence outpaces accountability? The Epstein case is referenced not because of shock value, but because it remains one of the clearest examples of that imbalance. As long as transparency arrives in fragments, the conversation continues. This email doesn't rewrite history, it doesn't issue blame, and it doesn't close the case. What it does is add another layer to a story that has always been more about structure than individuals, about how proximity to power can dull judgment, about how silence can outlast consequences, and about why public records, even years later, still matter. And that's where the real questions begin.